What if the vote you cast didn't actually matter the way you thought it did? Take a second and really think about that. Imagine standing in line, marking your ballot, believing that your choice is shaping the future of your country, only to find out later that the outcome you voted for was quietly rewritten behind closed doors. That's the question now spreading across Canada. Not in small circles, not just online, but everywhere. People are asking something they never thought they would have to ask in a modern democracy. Did my vote actually mean anything? Because what's happening right now doesn't feel normal. It doesn't feel like politics as usual. It feels like something deeper is breaking. And the scariest part, it didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, step by step, decision by decision, until suddenly people woke up and realized something didn't feel right anymore. Now here's where things start to get uncomfortable. The current government, led by Mark Carney, holds what looks like a majority. On paper, it seems legitimate. It looks like a normal democratic outcome. But when you dig just a little deeper, a completely different picture begins to appear. Because this majority wasn't actually won through a clear vote from the people. It was built after the election. Let that sink in. After Canadians had already voted, after the results were already decided, something changed. Several members of Parliament switched sides. Strategic by-elections were called, and slowly, piece by piece, the numbers shifted just enough to create a majority that voters never directly approved. Now, technically, every move followed the rules. That's what makes this so complicated. Nothing illegal happened, no laws were broken, everything was done by the book. But here's the real problem. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it reflects the will of the people. And that's where trust begins to crack. Because democracy doesn't survive on rules alone. It survives on belief. The belief that when you vote, your voice actually matters. The belief that the person you elect will represent you, not switch sides when it's convenient. The moment that belief starts to disappear, the entire system starts to feel like a performance. And right now, many Canadians feel like they're watching a performance instead of participating in a real democracy. Let's break this down even further. Imagine you voted for a candidate because you believed in their party, their policies, their promises. You trusted them to stand for those values in Parliament. Now imagine that same person walks across the floor and joins the opposite side. No warning, no permission, no new vote. Just like that, your vote is effectively handed to the other team. That's not just a political move, that feels personal, because it changes what your vote actually did. And for many people, that's where the frustration turns into something deeper, it turns into anger, and then something even worse, powerlessness. Because what can you do about it? Right now, the answer is not much. There's no immediate way to challenge that decision, no automatic re-election, no direct accountability in the moment. You have to wait until the next election while everything continues moving forward without you. And that's exactly why people are starting to feel disconnected. Because when you remove the ability for people to respond, you remove their sense of control. And when people feel like they have no control, something dangerous begins to happen. They stop caring. And that's where the real risk begins. Because anger still means people are engaged. Angry people show up, they argue, they debate, they vote. But powerless people, they disappear, they stop paying attention, they stop participating. They stop believing that anything they do will make a difference. And a democracy filled with people who no longer believe their voice matters is not a democracy for long. Now here's where things get even more intense. This isn't just about one or two politicians switching sides. This has become a pattern that people are noticing more and more. Every new floor crossing adds to the same feeling. Every strategic move adds to the same question. Is this really what voters chose? Or is this something else entirely? One case that has really captured attention is Marilyn Gladu. She represented a riding that had been consistently conservative for nearly 2 decades. In the last election, she received a strong majority of the vote, over 50%. That's not a close race, that's a clear decision from voters. And yet, she switched sides, without going back to her constituents, without asking for a new mandate. And suddenly this stops being just a political story. It becomes symbolic. Because people can point to it, they can see it, they can feel it. It becomes a real example of something that feels broken. And when people see something like that happen, they start asking bigger questions. What else is happening behind the scenes? What deals are being made? What promises are being exchanged? Even if there's no proof, the suspicion starts to grow. Because when trust is gone, people don't need evidence to feel like something isn't right. They just need uncertainty. And right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, this political tension is not happening in isolation. People are already struggling. The cost of living is rising. Housing is becoming harder to afford. Everyday expenses are putting pressure on families. So when people see political decisions that feel disconnected from their reality, it hits harder, much harder. Because now it's not just about politics, it's about fairness. It's about whether the system is actually working for them, or against them. And when those two things collide, economic pressure, and political distrust, you don't just get frustration, you get a crisis of confidence. Not just in leaders, but in the system itself. And once that kind of doubt starts to spread, it doesn't stay contained. It grows. It reaches more people, more conversations, more communities, until suddenly it becomes the dominant feeling, a feeling that something fundamental has changed. But here's the question that matters most. Is this the breaking point, or is this just the beginning of something even bigger? Because what happens next could redefine how people see democracy itself. So what really changed the moment this manufactured majority was locked in? At first glance, nothing dramatic, no explosions, no sudden announcements that shook the entire country, no obvious breaking point that everyone could point to and say, that's when everything changed. But that's exactly what makes this so powerful, because the real shift didn't happen loudly. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, and yet its impact was immediate. Before this majority existed, the government had to negotiate. Every major decision required cooperation. Other parties had leverage, they could push back, they could demand changes, they could slow things down. That's how a functioning democracy is supposed to work, not because it's efficient, but because it forces accountability. When no single group has full control, they have to listen, they have to compromise, they have to explain their decisions in a way that convinces others. But the moment that majority was created, that entire dynamic changed, almost overnight. Suddenly the need to negotiate disappeared. The pressure to justify decisions weakened. The opposition lost its ability to influence outcomes in any meaningful way. And what replaced it? Control. Now here's the part that often gets framed differently. This shift is usually described as efficiency. You'll hear phrases like, the government can finally move forward, or decisions can now be made without unnecessary delays. And on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. Who doesn't want a government that gets things done? But here's the deeper question. What happens when efficiency comes without accountability? Because efficiency without oversight isn't progress. It's concentration of power. And that's where things start to feel uncomfortable again. Because when people already question how that power was gained, giving that power even more freedom only amplifies the concern. Now let's connect this to something people feel every single day, the economy, because political trust doesn't exist in isolation. It's tied directly to how people experience their daily lives. And right now, for many Canadians, that experience is getting harder. Prices are rising, groceries cost more, housing feels out of reach for a growing number of people, fuel costs are hitting budgets in ways that weren't expected just a few years ago. And when people are already under pressure, they pay closer attention, they notice more, they question more. So when they see a government gaining power in a way that feels disconnected from their vote, and at the same time managing an economy that feels increasingly difficult to survive in, those two things don't stay separate. They merge into one story, a story where people start to feel like the system isn't working for them anymore. And once that story takes hold, it spreads fast. Because people don't need detailed policy explanations to feel that something is wrong. They just need to feel the pressure in their own lives. And right now, that pressure is real. Now here's where the situation becomes even more complex. Critics aren't just pointing at political decisions, they're pointing at economic decisions too. There are growing accusations that policies, especially around spending and money supply, have contributed to inflation. That choices made in the past are now showing their consequences in the present. And whether people fully understand those policies or not, they feel the results. Higher costs, less purchasing power, more uncertainty about the future. And when those feelings combine with political distrust, it creates something much bigger than dissatisfaction. It creates a sense that the system itself may be out of alignment. Now think about what that does psychologically. If people believe their vote doesn't change outcomes, and they also feel like their financial situation is getting worse, what incentive do they have to stay engaged? This is where the real danger begins to show. Because once people start connecting these dots, they don't just lose trust in one leader or one party. They start losing trust in everything. Government, institutions, even the idea that things can improve. And when that happens, the consequences go far beyond politics. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in situations like this. The role of media. Because how a story is told matters just as much as the story itself. Right now, many people feel that mainstream coverage is focusing too much on the technical side of what's happening. The procedures, the rules, the legality, and not enough on how people actually feel about it. Because from a technical standpoint, everything might look fine. But from a human standpoint, it doesn't feel fine at all. And when people feel like their emotions and concerns are being ignored, they start looking elsewhere. They turn to alternative voices, independent creators, online discussions. Not necessarily because those sources are more accurate, but because they feel acknowledged. And that shift in where people get their information, that's another signal of something deeper changing. Because once trust moves away from traditional institutions, it becomes very difficult to bring it back. Now let's zoom out even further, because this isn't just about one country. What's happening here is something that other nations are watching closely, because it raises a universal question. What happens when a democracy begins to lose the trust of its own people, not through one major event, but through a series of smaller decisions that slowly add up? There's no clear moment to point to, no single event to fix, just a gradual shift. That becomes visible only when it's already well underway. And by then, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. Now add one more layer to this, external pressure. Because Canada isn't operating in a vacuum, there are global challenges, trade tensions, economic competition, political realignments. All of these require strong leadership and, more importantly, public confidence. Because when a country faces external pressure, it needs unity, it needs trust, it needs people to believe that their leaders represent them. But if that belief is already weakened internally, then external challenges don't just test the system, they expose its weaknesses, and that's where things can escalate quickly. Because a country that is divided internally struggles to project strength externally. Now here's something that many people are quietly starting to consider. What if the real issue isn't just about specific decisions, but about the system itself? Because when the same patterns keep appearing, people start questioning whether the rules need to change. And that's exactly what we're beginning to see. There's a growing conversation around something called recall power. The idea that if an elected official switches parties after being voted in, there should be a way for voters to respond immediately, not years later, right away. Through a petition, through a vote, through a process that gives control back to the people. And when you think about it, it's a simple idea. If voters choose someone based on one platform, shouldn't they have a say if that platform suddenly changes? That question is becoming harder to ignore, because at its core, this entire situation comes down to one thing. Who actually holds the power? Is it the people, or is it the system that operates after the votes are counted? And depending on how that question is answered, everything else changes. But here's the twist. Even as these conversations grow louder, something else is happening at the same time. Something quieter, something less visible, but potentially more important. People are starting to disengage. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. What if the biggest threat to a democracy isn't anger? What if it's silence? Not the kind of silence where nothing is happening, but the kind where everything is happening and people just stop responding. Because that's exactly what seems to be spreading across Canada right now. Not just frustration, not just outrage, but something quieter, something heavier, disengagement. And at first, it doesn't look dangerous. It doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't dominate headlines. It doesn't show up in dramatic protests every single day. It shows up in smaller ways. People stop watching the news. They stop debating politics with friends. They stop believing that their voice matters. And slowly, they begin to step back. Now, here's why that matters more than anything else we've talked about so far. Because a democracy doesn't collapse the moment people get angry. It starts to weaken the moment people stop caring. Anger still means connection. Anger means people feel like they have something at stake. But when that anger turns into exhaustion, and that exhaustion turns into silence, that's when the foundation begins to crack. And this shift doesn't happen randomly. It follows a pattern. First comes confusion. People start noticing things that don't make sense. Decisions that feel disconnected, outcomes that don't match expectations. Then comes frustration. They talk about it, they argue, they question what's happening. Then comes anger. They push back, they demand answers, they look for someone to hold accountable. But if nothing changes, if their concerns are dismissed or ignored, that anger doesn't last forever. It transforms into something far more dangerous. Powerlessness, that feeling that no matter what you do, nothing will change. And once people reach that point, they don't fight harder, they step away. Now think about what that does to a system that relies on participation. Voting rates drop, public engagement decreases, fewer people show up to challenge decisions, and suddenly the system still exists. But the connection between the people and that system begins to fade. It becomes what some are starting to describe as a hollow performance. Everything looks the same on the surface. Elections still happen, leaders still speak, policies are still announced, but underneath, the sense of ownership is gone. Now here's where this becomes even more serious, because disengagement doesn't affect everyone equally. It often hits certain regions harder than others. In Canada, places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of British Columbia are already experiencing deeper levels of frustration. These are regions where people have long felt politically distant from the center of power. And when events like floor crossings happen, it reinforces that feeling. It creates a narrative that no matter how these regions vote, the final outcome will still be shaped elsewhere. And when that belief takes hold, it doesn't just create dissatisfaction, it creates alienation, a sense that the system doesn't represent you and maybe never did. And once that idea spreads, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because now it's not just about one issue. It's about identity, about belonging, about whether people feel like they are truly part of the country's future. Now let's take this one step further, because disengagement doesn't just stay within national borders. It affects how a country operates on the global stage. Think about it. If a government is facing internal doubts about its legitimacy, how strong does it look externally? How confident can it be in negotiations? How united can it appear when dealing with international challenges? Because global pressure doesn't wait for internal issues to be resolved. It continues. Trade tensions, economic competition, geopolitical shifts. All of these require strong, credible leadership backed by public support. But if that support is weakening, if people are questioning the system itself, then those external challenges become even harder to manage. Not because they've changed, but because the country facing them has. And here's the key idea to understand. External pressure doesn't create internal weakness. It reveals it. And right now, that weakness is becoming more visible. Now let's bring this back to something very human. Because behind all of these systems and structures, there are people, real people, families trying to make ends meet, workers dealing with rising costs, young people wondering if they'll ever be able to afford a home. These are the people absorbing all of this, not as a political debate, but as part of their daily reality. And when those daily struggles combine with political uncertainty, it creates a powerful emotional response, not just frustration, but fatigue. Because it's exhausting to feel like you're fighting on multiple fronts. Financial pressure, political uncertainty, a sense that things are moving in a direction you can't control. And over time, that exhaustion leads to disengagement. Now here's something that might seem small, but is actually very important: humor. You may have noticed that people are starting to joke about serious issues. Even something as extreme as losing sovereignty or invasion gets mentioned in a sarcastic or exaggerated way. But that humor isn't random. It's a coping mechanism, because humor allows people to express something that feels too heavy to say directly. It's a way of saying, this situation feels out of control, without fully confronting the fear behind it. And when those kinds of jokes start spreading, it's often a sign that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Because humor like that doesn't come from comfort. It comes from uncertainty. Now let's connect all of this together. Political distrust, economic pressure, regional alienation, institutional skepticism. These are not separate issues. They are layers of the same story, each one reinforcing the other, each one making the overall situation more intense. And when you combine them, you don't just get dissatisfaction, you get a shift in perception, a shift in how people see the system itself. And once that perception changes, it changes expectations for the future. People start preparing for different outcomes. They start thinking differently about what's possible and what isn't. And that's where things become unpredictable, because when large groups of people begin to disengage, the system doesn't just continue as normal. It changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always in ways that are difficult to control. Now here's the question that we need to ask at this point. Is this disengagement permanent, or can it be reversed? Because history shows us that trust can be rebuilt. But it takes time, it takes transparency, it takes real accountability, not just words, but actions. And right now, many people are waiting to see if those actions will come. But what happens if they don't? What happens if disengagement continues to grow? What happens if more and more people step back, stop participating, stop believing? That's the question that leads us into the final part of this story. Because in part 4, we're going to explore what the future might look like if this trend continues, what possible outcomes could emerge, and whether there's still a path to rebuild trust before it's too late. Because once a system loses the confidence of its people, getting it back is one of the hardest things any nation can do.